Let me tell you about a man named Julian. He ran a billion-dollar tech empire. And for him, this wasn't some philosophical question. It was his only way out. He went to the one place on Earth he thought could finally silence his mind. But he never could have imagined what would speak to him in its place.
What happens when you stop thinking? Not just daydreaming or finding a quiet moment, but what if the inner voice you've known your whole life, the narrator in your head that never, ever stops talking, just goes silent? Section 1. The Prison of Thought. Julian lived at the center of a world he built, and he was its first prisoner. His days were a relentless siege of information. Notifications chimed like tiny hammers against his skull. His calendar was a mosaic of obligations, each colored block another slice of his life sold to the machine he'd created. But the noise outside was nothing compared to the noise inside. His own mind was the real tyrant. It was a constant, churning monologue of analysis, strategy, and worry. It replayed past conversations, hunting for mistakes. It rehearsed future meetings, scripting every possible outcome. That voice was the architect of his success, the engine of his empire, but it had grown so powerful, it was now consuming him. He'd stand in his glass-walled office, look out over the city, and feel nothing. The view was just data. The skyline, a chart of competitors. Joy, peace, presence. These felt like luxuries he deemed inefficient long ago. He realized with a chilling clarity that he hadn't truly experienced a single moment of his life for over a decade. He had only thought about it, analyzed it, lived in a mental simulation of it.
The breaking point wasn't some dramatic collapse. It was a quiet, terrifying moment of emptiness. He was in a board meeting presenting projections of exponential growth. When he looked at the faces around the table and saw ghosts, he heard his own voice speaking, but the words felt like they belonged to someone else. In that instant, the sheer, pointless weight of it all became unbearable. He needed an off switch, not for his phone, but for the voice in his head. That night, instead of researching market trends, he researched silence. He found a small, almost unheard of conservation project deep in a remote jungle. A place completely off the grid, no schedules, no goals, no people. The perfect void. He made a decision his board would call insanity. He would go for 3 months and take a complete vow of silence. No speaking, reading, or writing. He wasn't going to find himself. He was going to lose himself. He was going to wage war on the voice in his head, and he wouldn't stop until only silence remained. Section 2. The Louder Silence. The jungle wasn't the peaceful sanctuary he'd imagined. It was a suffocating wall of life. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth, decay, and blooming flowers. And the noise was overwhelming, a chaotic orchestra of insects. The screech of unseen birds, the rustle of things in the undergrowth. In his sterile, controlled world, silence meant the absence of sound. Here, silence didn't exist. He expected that removing the distractions of his old life would bring instant relief. He was wrong. Without meetings or emails, his mind didn't quiet down. It turned on itself with ferocious intensity. It was like a wild animal, suddenly uncaged, pacing and roaring inside his skull. The inner monologue that was a constant hum back home was now a deafening scream. For the first week, every regret he'd ever had played on a loop. Every mistake, every harsh word, every missed opportunity, all presented with fresh, agonizing detail. He tried to meditate, to focus on his breath like the book said. But it was a battle. He'd command his mind to be quiet, and it would rebel with a flood of anxious thoughts. He'd focus on his breath, and his mind would mock him for failing. He was a CEO. He solved problems, he built systems, so he applied that same ruthless efficiency to this project. He created a rigid schedule for meditation. He tried to force the thoughts out, to wrestle them into submission. He would sit for hours, his body rigid with effort, his jaw clenched, fighting a war against himself.
and he was losing badly. The more he fought, the louder the noise became. The more he craved silence, the more his mind churned out a cacophony of thought. He felt a despair he'd never known. He had conquered the business world, bent markets to his will, and built an empire from a single idea. But he could not conquer his own mind. The jungle, his supposed sanctuary, had become a torture chamber, amplifying the very prison he had tried to escape. He was more trapped than ever, lost in a wilderness with no way out of the storm raging inside him. Section 3. The Surrender. Weeks bled into a month, then 2. Julian was gaunt, bearded, and haunted. The jungle had stripped away his corporate armor, leaving him raw. His desperate fight for control had led him to complete and utter exhaustion. He'd tried every technique, every mental trick, every last ounce of his formidable willpower, and all of it had failed. One afternoon, a torrential rainstorm swept through the forest. He didn't bother to find shelter. He just sat on a mossy rock, letting the downpour soak him to the bone. And in that moment, something inside him finally broke. It wasn't despair, but a quiet, profound release. He gave up. He stopped fighting. He stopped trying to silence his thoughts. He stopped trying to meditate correctly. He just stopped. He surrendered, not as a strategy, but as a complete and total abdication. He let the thoughts come, anxieties about his company, memories of his childhood, a stupid jingle from an old commercial. They bubbled up, and for the first time, he didn't grab onto them. He didn't analyze them or push them away. He just watched them, like raindrops falling into a puddle. Yeah, he acknowledged them with a detached, weary curiosity, and then let them go. He saw the problem then. He'd been trying to use his mind to defeat his mind, using the tool of his torment to find peace. In that moment of surrender, for the first time, he stepped outside of it. He was no longer the thinker, but the awareness watching the thinking. As the rain softened, he started to notice the spaces. In between the end of one thought and the start of the next, there was a gap, a tiny pocket of pure silence. At first it was fleeting, a microsecond of peace. But as he continued to just watch, without effort, the gaps began to widen. The storm in his mind, the one he had fueled with his resistance, was finally running out of energy. One thought arose and floated away. Then another. Then nothing. The space stretched. 1 second, 5, 30. An entire minute passed, and his mind was perfectly still. The inner narrator that had defined his entire life was gone. There was no commentary, no analysis, no judgment. There was only the sound of the dripping jungle, the feeling of cool air on his skin, and a vast, profound, and beautiful silence within. It wasn't empty. It felt like coming home. Section 4. The Voice in the Void. For days, Julian lived in this silence. It was a state of being he never could have imagined. He was awake, alert, more alive than ever. But the entity he'd always thought of as himself, the incessant planner and worrier, was gone. He moved through the jungle, ate and slept, not through conscious decisions, but with a simple, intuitive flow. He was acting without an actor. This silence wasn't an absence, but a presence. It was a boundless field of awareness, and he was part of it. He felt the life of the jungle not as something separate from him, but as an extension of his own being. The world was no longer just something to be observed and labeled, it was something to be felt directly. Then one evening, as he watched the moon rise through the canopy, something new emerged from that silence. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't his old inner voice. It was something else. A kind of knowing. A vast, impersonal, and ancient consciousness seemed to rise within him like a tide. It didn't have a voice, yet it communicated with perfect clarity. It felt less like hearing words and more like remembering a truth he had forgotten for 1,000 lifetimes. This presence wasn't interested in Julian, the CEO. It had no concern for his company, his wealth, his personal history. All of that was just a minor detail in a much grander picture. The presence began to show him things, not in images, but in direct understanding. It showed him the nature of the voice that had tormented him. It revealed the ego, the I he thought he was, as a kind of phantom, a complex knot of memories, fears, and desires, held together only by the constant energy of thought. A ghost chattering to itself, to convince itself it was real. His burnout, his anxiety, his ambition. It was all the desperate activity of an illusion, fighting against its own disappearance. He felt the interconnectedness of everything around him, the same life that animated the crawling vine and the silent jaguar was the life that animated him. The feeling of separation, he understood, was an illusion created by the mind. This ancient awareness communicated a simple, earth-shattering idea. He was not a drop in the ocean. He was the entire ocean in a drop. Section 5. The Revelation. The wisdom that flowed into Julian wasn't a set of rules. It was a fundamental reordering of his reality. This awareness, speaking from the silent core of his being, began to unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. The understanding that came to him was this: what we call consciousness isn't something we have, it's what we are. The fundamental fabric of existence itself, singular and unified. Every star, every planet, every living creature is just a temporary pattern in this single cosmic ocean of awareness. The sense of being a separate self, a Julian who was born and would one day die, was the primary illusion. His ego wasn't his true identity. It was just a mask that consciousness wore for a while. The voice in his head, he now saw, was the mechanism that kept the illusion going. Every thought starting with "I want," "I fear," or "I think" reinforced the existence of a separate I. That's why his mind had been so relentless. His ego, sensing its own emptiness, had to generate a constant stream of thoughts to keep from collapsing, like a spinning top that falls the moment it stops moving. His ambition, his stress, his identity as a CEO, all of it was just the top spinning faster and faster, a frantic defense against the stillness that would reveal its true nature. He came to see that the universe doesn't happen to you, it happens as you. His struggle with the world was just the friction of his small, illusory self rubbing up against the totality of reality. He'd spent his life trying to impose his will on the world. This new awareness showed him the futility of that. It's like a single wave trying to command the ocean. True power, it communicated, wasn't in control, but in surrender, in the wisdom of aligning with the flow of the whole, rather than fighting it. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by your own mind or trapped in your own head, consider subscribing for more journeys into the nature of consciousness. And let us know in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment of true mental silence? What did it feel like? Section 6. The Integration. In the final weeks, the experience began to shift. The ancient consciousness didn't stay a separate voice. Instead, it began to merge with his own awareness. The distinction between Julian and the vast intelligence slowly dissolved. His own consciousness was simply expanding, to recognize itself as that larger reality. The silence remained, but now it felt like his own. The wisdom was no longer a transmission. It was his natural way of seeing. The frantic, chattering ego didn't return. In its place was a quiet, stable center of peace. He was still Julian, but the name now just referred to a body and a history, not a walled-off fortress of fear and desire. When it was time to leave the jungle, there was no anxiety. He didn't worry about his company or what came next. He just packed his few belongings and walked the long trail back to the world. He didn't return to his old life. He couldn't. It would be like a man who has seen the sun, trying to go back to living in a cave. He sold his shares in the company, a move that sent shock waves through the financial world, but felt as natural to him as breathing. The old goals, more growth, more market share, now seemed like a children's game. He wasn't reborn as a saint or a guru. He was just a man who had stopped fighting with reality. He moved through the world with a quiet grace. The compulsion to achieve had been replaced by a simple joy in being. He found meaning, not in grand accomplishments, but in the texture of a single moment. Conclusion. We started by asking, what happens when you stop thinking? Julian's story is one possible answer. He went on a journey to escape the prison of his mind, thinking that silence was the end goal. But he discovered that silence wasn't the destination. It was the doorway. By letting go of the relentless narrator in his head, he didn't become empty. He made space for everything else. His journey suggests that the real cage we live in isn't the world around us, but the story our mind tells us about it. We're trapped by the voice that insists on our separateness, our importance, our fears. Shackled by the ego, the ghost in the machine, that runs on a constant diet of thought. Maybe true freedom isn't found in gaining more control over our lives, but in surrendering the very part of us that craves that control. Maybe the greatest discovery isn't finding out who we are, but realizing what we are not. Julian's journey wasn't about becoming a better version of himself. It was about letting go of self altogether, and in that, finding his connection to everything. It leaves us with a question. That voice you hear in your head right now, the one you've always assumed is you, what if it isn't? What if it's the one thing standing between you and everything else?